Thanks, Adam. So I also want to just add to the list of thanks the filmmakers who are sharing their work with us this evening, and especially those who could be here in person and will be in discussion with us afterwards. So thank you all. And of course my colleague and your collaborative screener for tonight's program, Jheanelle. So one of the things that I was thinking about in reviewing some of these films was Sergei Eisenstein's definition of montage as a collision productive of thought. And the films in tonight's program are widely divergent in terms of style and subject and aesthetic, but perhaps one thing they have in common is some kind of relationship to montage. But here montage is being used as a tool, and I think maybe specifically for the creation of consciousness. I was reminded, as I was thinking about that, I had the great fortune of teaching while Jheanelle's exhibition was up at Art and Practice. Time is running out of time. And I asked Jheanelle, like on behalf of in front of my students, what they should know or be thinking about as young experimental filmmakers. And she said to question the medium, that images can be weaponized for good or not, and that you need to think about what you're substantiating and what you're giving value to. And that was a thought that occurred to me again and again as I was watching the films in tonight's program.
Mike. Hey y'all, thanks for coming. Well, one, thank you, Madison. Madison is the one that first approached me with this idea to do a program together, and he's truly been a great collaborator. Also want to second the thanks for all the filmmakers present. We thought we were only going to have Darol and Sara, but then Ufouma and Ariella happened to be in town as well. So y'all are in for a treat to get 2/3 of the whole program in for a dynamic conversation. And also for me, something that I try to hold in the work that I do and how I navigate the world is thinking about fugitivity, and I constantly go back to Stefano Harney and Fred Moten's book, The Undercommons. And I think one of the things that all of these films articulate is how to operate with fugitivity in terms of knowledge production, methodologies, the archive, etc. And I think they truly are valuable, not just artistically and aesthetically, but in terms of pedagogy, methodology, etc. So I think you all are in for a treat. Please stay around and have your questions ready, and thanks again. Apologies in advance for what's a kind of long-winded entry into my first question, but so in the first film, Giverny, Negress Imperial by Jatavia Gary, there's the clip that Diamond Reynolds uploaded to Facebook, and in another film made about sort of Jatavia's process, one of the things she says is that she was really struck by the multiple people, the multiple modes of address that kind of Diamond has to perform while she's dealing with a heinous and traumatic thing that happened. So she's talking to the police, she's talking to her child, she's talking to God, she's talking to the public, she's talking to bystanders, she's talking to her family. And one of the things that Jatavia was speaking about, that clip, that clip was the multiple ways in which Diamond had to perform because of her proximity to white violence. But in any case, thinking about the ways that Jatavia talked about these multiple modes of addresses sort of has me thinking about the multiple ways in which you all's films are situated, can be situated, and also just leads me to wonder and ask you all to talk about just the ways in which you came to your projects, whether it was maybe personal, whether it was a way to correct distortive, exclusive historicity, whether it was a way to unpack, deal with trauma, grief, etc. Just want to ask you to talk about the ways in which you came to your project and to the ways in which they're situated and who and how they're addressing. Start with whoever wants to start first. I figured it was going to be you. Just
well, thank you for having me. So for me, I think I was just trying to reconcile. I had lost my father. I was taking care of my father for about 10 years, staying with me. So after his sudden passing, it caused me to reflect on the loss of my children, who I lost in a different way. They moved to the other side of the country, and so losing my father prompted me to think about this relationship with my children, and in turn that prompted me to think about my father's relationship to his father. And so I took an autobiographical model or example using myself, but hopefully to maybe say something more about the relationship between loss, death, and creativity and survival, right? So how all these things are the interplay between loss and its relationship to I guess just expression, and in this way kind of a whole host of feelings from joy to sadness and so forth, to try to take the autobiographical route to say something about the historical process of and relationship between death and creation.
Sorry, I can go. Is it on? Is it on? Can you hear me? Okay, cool. I think something that you said during the introduction really resonated with me about formation of consciousness. I think that I came to making this video trying to materialize my own consciousness and the ways in which I spectate film, spectate media, and think about the ways in which I process narrative, and also my sort of aspirational ways of processing narrative and my imaginations around it, taking in, focusing particularly on things that are produced by mainstream media, and trying to kind of redress a lot of the harm that I see, but also kind of sit in that space, thinking about where rage and desire intersect, and also intersect with violence, and think about sort of things that are less permissible to see manifest publicly, things like revenge, which is something that I think about a lot. Yeah.
I think when I came to make this film, it didn't really start off as personal. It came off as about I was making work for an exhibition at Barbican at the time, and I had a completely different idea. And then I went actually and saw Nothing But a Man, and I kind of fell in love with Abby Lincoln again, and just spent kind of 2 months really obsessing over her and her work and her music, and just watching interviews of her. And then I became this kind of real love affair and affection of her work as an actor and activist. And then it was also, I was reading a lot from Darlene Brooks's essays, and she has this particular essay about black female soul singing in surrogation in the age of catastrophe. And so then this film kind of became a response to that essay, and I really wanted to explore black women's kind of collective activism through music. And it became kind of just daily, just watching lots of videos and watching lots of stuff and going through the archives and finding and searching out for these moments of joy and black happiness in the archive, in that context. And then it became almost, in another sense, personal to me, kind of seeking out those images and then putting it together. And I really kind of just wanted to kind of disrupt this historical narrative of like pain and suffering and put this film that, or create something that was very much kind of interrogating that notion of what black suffering is, what black pain is specifically for black women. And so then I also found images like Grace Jones singing, and then it became almost just real love of it and like appreciation of like black music and black men in that context. So I think that's how it first initially started for me.
I was responding to my own feelings, I guess, and specifically frustration and anger that because we completely misunderstood and misrepresented our own history, we're actually just missing a massive amount of an understanding of ourselves as a country and as individuals. I grew up in Virginia, and I was thinking about what it meant to be from a place if you don't understand what it is. And also, gosh, there was a lot of things I was thinking about. I think it's, I was thinking about the idea of history as a pollution on the landscape and something that can infect you even if you don't know that it's there.
So that actually leads into one of the questions that I wanted to ask, which is also about you mentioned going through the archive. It's also about the use of archive and or the historical record in all the works. So I was noticing that there's a really affective use of archive, like the way it just kind of touches us and the way it feels, like when the music and the images are on screen. And also therefore an associative linkage, I think especially in your projects. But I was struck by one moment in your film where it cuts from the quote, "One way to do that is to expose it and dissect it," which kind of speaks to this kind of historical intervention that we were talking about in the beginning of the program. But then the cut is actually to that performance, the drum solo by, I think it's Max Roach. And it's just such a powerful, it was like, for me, the moment where the two different ways of using montage come together to produce this big thought and big feeling at the same time, to put it simply. So it's just the big question is, can you talk about the use of archive and or the way that you're using that in order to think about history?
Yeah, so for me, I use archives as a medium in itself, I think, in my work. Most of my films are usually found footage. And I think for me, it's almost kind of like, not correcting the archive, but drawing out from the archive a sort of a history of for me personally, it's looking at black history and black history, like black diaspora, black Atlantic. And I'm looking at the archive and seeing what I can get from it. The archive is usually something that's kind of curated by certain institutions or certain people, but I'm looking at archive in the form of like telling a kind of disrupting history, disrupting narratives, and kind of forming my own kind of narrative of what I want to say or what I want to tell. And also, when you're looking at archives, for me, my kind of opinion of what I'm making also changes from what I'm viewing. And when I was making this film, I was watching lots of different archives and lots of like kind of home videos of what I'd found, and it kind of changed the kind of course of what I thought I was wanting to make or what I wanted to say. But yeah, for me, archives is a really powerful tool for me of addressing kind of the discrepancies within historical narratives and also in the gaps within archives itself as well. I also work in archives as well, and so I work within an archive in an institution, and so seeing what goes into archives and who kind of creates it and who is responsible for kind of maintaining those archives is also very important. So in my work, I use archives as a form of kind of addressing historical discrepancies in that film.
So I guess I'm next. On the question of archive, I feel like I've been working with and sitting with archives for maybe like the past 4 or 5 years. And so, I mean, this project is informed by both personal and I guess like the historical archive. And I think, I took the lead from my children, like before, when they were getting ready to leave, they're always like so technologically like savvy. right? So my daughter always has my phone in her hand, and she was always recording, and she knew like I worked in film, and she would be like, let's make a movie. And she knew they were leaving. My son didn't really understand it, but my daughter knew. So she was like, let's make a movie. Let's make a movie out of this, right? And so that became kind of the guide, just like collecting it for myself. Like the last month, I think I just spent with them. Like I didn't do anything. I just stayed in, and we just like we went places and we just recorded everything. And I just had it. I just kept it like close to me. And then when my father passed, it was like the absence of an archive. Like my father didn't tell me, you know, he was a quiet man, but he didn't really talk about, he had 2 brothers, he never spoke their name to me. I didn't know much about my father. That was just like our relationship. And so it was like, one was like the fullness of the archive on one hand with my children, but then like the absence of the archive with my father, right? So I went searching for an archive, and I just literally kind of created it out of thin air. I have like these photo albums that are supposed to be of him. I think it may potentially be him in the photo, I don't know, right? And I have other things, you know, audio clips that are in the film that are literally record collections, like actual cassettes. I don't know if people, it's like young folks here, I don't know if people know what like cassettes are, right? But like there's cassette tapes that I recorded at the studio, and just kind of took snippets out, and they all have a particular relationship to my father. Like Martin Lawrence was his favorite comedian. That's a Martin in there. Malcolm X is an important figure, because that was the first book I stole from his library and like read cover to cover and just like changed my mind. But I guess I'm trying to do the double work of like creating an archive, but also kind of speaking back to like the gaps in the archive and kind of blurring the line between personal and historical archives as well. Yeah, I'll start there.
I think that for me, I think about like the different kinds of archives, specifically within relationship to like film and media studies. So thinking about, I like to focus on particular performers and go through their entire history of making work, and think about their roles kind of as contiguous, especially focusing on films that I think are like more forgotten. I think that there can, I don't know, just like trying to pick out like specific moments and specific points of narrative. Yeah, so like I think that, you know, there'll be like, for someone like Halle Berry, for instance, like there'll be particular points in her career that are considered to be like the most important or the most decisive, and then there are all these other like performances that kind of like fall by the wayside, but it's like hours and hours and hours and hours of performance. So thinking about like within these archives, like what is forgotten, but also like what's hidden, and thinking about like the kind of like agency within films where they're kind of like, you know, like the narrative is like less important, or like it's given less value, and there become like, I just like think about like the agency in performance and like the agency from within the archive, and like how that it can exist through like gesture, gaze, yeah.
And actually that ties into something I've been thinking about, and I wanted to ask all of you all, is sort of the ways in which your films stand, like they don't necessarily traffic too much in the abject or in abjection. Like Darol, for instance, your film, so much of it is about loss. And one of the things I know you and I have talked about a lot is how people, particularly Black people, but how people sort of exist outside purely just modalities of survival. So in general, something I want to have you all talk about, if you may, are just how you don't necessarily go to a point where this is about objection, but you still talk about pain, you still talk about trauma, you still talk about gaps in the historical record, you still touch on slavery, monuments, etc. But just yeah, how it's not necessarily abject, and also just in general, like what are the emotions or even moods, tones, etc., that you felt like you wanted to communicate with these pieces?
Well, that was actually pretty hard with the film that I made, given that it was about really a painful history. But a friend of mine one day was really angry and ranting about Civil War films and said that he was complaining to me about how white people love the performance and reenactment of black pain. And that was really, something I really frequently think about, actually, when I see how that war is represented in our popular culture, and what people sort of like to fixate on. And actually, when I was researching the film, one of the difficulties I encountered was that a lot of the historical record is incorrect or is outright lies sometimes, depending on who wrote it. We have a record on the land of battlefields and cemeteries and monuments and things, and those are curated as well. So that's part of what I was thinking about.
Yeah, I think one of the things I think about when I watch a lot of popular media especially is just like how for performers and for Black spectators too, like watching a lot of the narratives that are created for us is violence. Like there are violent stories, and like having those kinds of narratives and like representations like constantly reinscribed over and over again as an act of violence on the spectator as well. And like I think about like, I don't know, and sometimes I feel like, it's sticky because I want people to be able to like, make a living and do the things that they want to do and make their art, but I also think about like agency and like the cost of having to like reenact certain stories or reenact certain things over and over again. Yeah.
Sorry if that's not answering the question.
Every answer is an answer. It's all good.
That also segues into another question I had, and this was actually specifically for Darol, just because we've talked about violence and masculinity at a couple points in tonight's conversation, and I was actually really struck watching it this time how your movie, I feel, demonstrates like another type of masculinity, and specifically because there's so many images of like men overcome with emotion. It starts with, there's the cut from a moment where a man cannot speak, like literally cutting to a moment, not where a man is speaking, but where he can't speak because he's, filled with emotion. And after that, that kind of leads to a string of images of men experiencing that. So I was just curious if you wanted to talk about kind of, was that a conscious putting forth a different vision of what masculinity could mean or could be?
It wasn't intentional. I mean, it's me. I was trying to be as open and as vulnerable as possible. Like, I made this for my children, right? And I made this for my father. And like, that's me. Like, anyone who knows me, my friend Sophie, I was like right behind Sophie, just crying. But like, that's me. Like, I feel like I was trying to make something that felt honest and genuine to who I am and true to that moment of creation. Right, there's autobiographical, but also very much informed by the historical moment that made me, in this particular context, right? So I'm not exceptional in any way. Like I'm not gonna be up on here and be like, yeah, I offer the alternative model to masculinity. I think I'm just as, it's all complicated. You know what I mean? And I'm just trying to be honest to those feelings and in relationship to this story, this personal story, this collective story. For me, it's a personal and collective story that kind of tries to be genuine to both. So yeah, I just try to be honest, and I mean, there's parts of myself in it. For folks who know me, they know I'm kind of very much sat and very much in that way, just trying to get to a genuine reflection of my feelings. And I mean, when I showed the film a couple times, and for me, as long as I have an emotional response to the film, I'm gonna keep showing it, right? And so that's just what it is, just a document for me that kind of allows me to process grief and to process loss, and to think about the question of like abstraction, and think about like the question of like violence. Like, yeah, it's like a proximity to death, it's a proximity to loss, but there's so much joy. I'm crying most of the time because it's like rememory. You know, I'm not remembering something, it's like rememory, like I'm imagining a different life that my father could have had, or like a different life I could have with my children. So.
Actually, is there a mic for audience questions? If not, I'll run it up myself. I can run it up. It seems like a moment to move to that. Do folks have questions? Does anyone wants to start?
Can you just identify all the pictures?
Oh yeah, let's have y'all identify yourselves. Obviously I know you, but I want to give you that.
Hi, I'm Ariella.
I'm Darol.
Hi, I'm Ufouma.
I'm Sara.
Okay, I got another one. I go to the bank. Oh, okay. My bad. I'll leave it up here, so if we could do a self-pass, make a communal thing.
Hello, everyone. This question is for everyone, and if you could elaborate on the challenges that you faced in making these films, be it in the writing process or photography, or in particular the editing, which across the board the editing is very precise in all of these. So yeah, if you care to elaborate.
I kind of didn't make the film forwards in a way. I started out with one plan, in short, abandoned it, and then found myself walking around shooting landscapes that felt important to me somehow, and then I would do research about them and find out what had happened there in the past, and started to put together the film that way. So it was a little bit difficult because I never really knew what I was going to come out with.
Yeah, I think I had quite a chaotic process when I was making this film. So I was making work for an exhibition at the Barbican, and before, I think 8 months prepared, but I was originally planning to make this film I was going to shoot and then edit and then incorporate archive. But then it got to 2 days before the show, and I was like, that wasn't working. So then I made this film in 2 days, and then I screened it as a 3-screen installation instead of a single channel. And then it became a lot bigger than what I thought it was going to be in terms of the scale, projected onto glass. But just the making of the film came out of this really kind of, all the ideas I had before weren't working, so I kind of just I need to just make something that I want to make instead of making something that I think I should make. So I made this film out of that process of just kind of redressing what I should be actually making. But yeah, 2 days of really just panic and mania kind of created this film. So yeah, it went from there. But yeah, that was my process.
I made mine over the course of 4 days while I was a resident at the Echo Park Film Center. A lot of it is as a result of working on, so I was collecting archival material for maybe 3-4 years, so I had a lot of it. I'm always just in the archive and always collecting stuff, and stuff is always floating around. I was lucky enough to be working on a project, and a lot of the folks are here, my Parallax Black News family. And so I think having this personal archive and growing it, but also assisting and working on another project kind of just was like perfect synergy, because it was like a stream of consciousness, but then I could also kind of just hone into specific moments. And my guy Claudius, who was key in the editing, you gotta hold your hand up, Claudius, I'm gonna call you out. He was foundational. So his help was instrumental in kind of like smoothing things out and rearrangement, and just kind of getting it to where I thought it would, or where we thought it would kind of, where it made the most sense in terms of its feel. And this is over like 3 days, so it was kind of intense, but yeah.
I think that, it took me a long time to kind of like collect all the footage that I used, and I just kind of like sat with it for a long time. I think the biggest difficulty was just that this piece felt very like emotionally hard for me to make. Just like dealing with all the feelings that were brought up by all the different things that I was working with was difficult. But it started with the piece of wanting to reshape the main narrative in Scandal, and thinking about that for a long time, and then finding this like very small role that the actor who plays Fitz was in a different television show where he gets murdered, and kind of like wanting to reshape it around that, and then kind of having it spiral out from there.
There was another one.
Thanks. Congratulations, everybody. This question, maybe not all films apply to the question, but it's also maybe a question for the curators, and that might include Darol for other programs. Having to do with form, I was thinking about Jheanelle's absolutely critical comment to a direction to Madison's students about interrogating the form, questioning the medium was their number one job, I would think. And I'm curious about the use of special, like extra photographic effects, like digital manipulation of imagery. And it struck me that that's a way of, and it was, maybe I can put it that where the photographic image is unacceptable, and digitally manipulating it gives us a chance to change things, to create a new language. Can you comment on that? Or is that what you might be thinking about and using in curating or making?
I mean, there's a lot of context in which I think about the ontology of an image, and maybe I'll also reference some conversations with some folks that could kind of illustrate that. In talking to Michelle Duzan, who directed a film called Ex Utero, her talking about the sort of colonial project that photography propped up and continues to prop up. In talking to Ramel Ross, director of Hale County, this evening, him talking about the ways in which the photographic image is used to co-sign racism, and in his work, how he is really just trying to literally just create as many images, varied and authentic images of Black people, to just sort of like hammer the photographic image with wider representations. And also just thinking about the ways in which like the digital broadly, but also social media has completely empowered particularly Black people with our own created vernacular that is unparalleled and very specific and very important. So particular, like even, so I think, yeah, just agency to manipulate. And Ariella and I were talking, we're getting coffee right before the program, and you were talking about, you know, playing with the glitch and also using things that are cheap or free, and you're saying pushing them to their limits, like thinking, like there's so many cinematic techniques and things that are amazing and do amazing things, but what happens when those things are inaccessible for various reasons, right? So how are the ways in which folks can use what's around them to illustrate a point of view that is kind of emboldened by the advancement of technology, but also under attack because of surveillance. Like there's so much wrapped in that, but certainly it's emboldened by the specific things that we're able to do with the digital. So I feel like that was all over the place, but that's all wrapped up in there.
Yeah, and I agree, and I'll just try and be brief. The only thing that I could add to that is, I think in my own education, we talked a lot about radicalism, but I don't know what we meant by that. And so I was struck, the quote from Malcolm X in your piece, we have to go to the root. We have to go to the cause, because dealing with the condition is not enough. And that's literally the definition of radical, is to go to the root. That's where the word comes from. And so I was also thinking about Bell Hooks in Art of My Mind talks about one pole of art being art as the practice of freedom, as she calls it. And then she says that in order to do that, though, that's a project that first requires a decolonization of the mind. And I hear you saying that the whole history of cinema, the technology, the apparatus, is wrapped up in that colonial project. And so that the whole thing has to be decolonized. So that's just one of the things that I think about, not only as a programmer, but as a person, is how to participate in that project.
Let's not forget that After Effects is a product of dominant culture.
Something's all right after that?
Yeah.
I think that's actually all the time that we have. Thank you all so much for coming.